Today on Ag News Daily.
We work tirelessly at state legislative bodies. We've been out in D.C. quite a bit very recently to ensure that farmers still have access to those pesticides and those chemistries that we know are a critical part of modern day production agriculture.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show. This is Tanner and Delaney joining you virtually this time.
Yeah, that's right. You've had a busy week this week, Tanner.
It has been busy. We just got back, literally just drove in from the Ag PhD Field Day in Baltic, South Dakota. First time I'd ever been. And before we get into the weather, talk about perfect weather. 73 degrees, partly cloudy, slight breeze. Couldn't have asked for a better day.
It certainly has been nice here across central Iowa and parts of the Midwest. I know you're going to give us a weekly weather update, Tanner, so take it away.
I can do that. We did see a slow-moving front that made its way across the Midwest this week. Some areas saw heavy rain and severe storms as that system moved through. Despite the recent heat and storm activity, though, conditions have remained mostly favorable for corn and soybeans. More showers are likely to return next week. In the central and southern plains, that same front pushed southward. That brought rain chances that tapered off as it reached the southern plains. Cooler temperatures did settle in behind that system and are expected to linger into next week. Northern areas could see a few more rounds of showers over the weekend and into the early parts of next week. In the northern plains, scattered showers and storms have continued almost daily. They are expected to persist into next week, while the risk of widespread severe weather has stayed low. Rainfall is helping build soil moisture. However, wheat is nearing maturity that could be affected by these heavier rains and could impact the quality as their harvest approaches. I will tell you, Delaney, driving across much of Iowa, up a little bit of I-29 into South Dakota, there was some wind. You could see evidence of some tangled fields, maybe a little matted soybeans, some lodging going on. But overall, it does show signs of stress where that moisture ponds and sits. So there's probably plenty of rain, at least in parts of Iowa. Some reports of even 6 inches overnight during one of those storm fronts. But overall, it seems to be favorable.
Yeah, and a derecho reported earlier this week for parts of Minnesota and Iowa in particular. So we will see how that fares here for crops next week. But on this week's weekly crop progress report, we saw small gains for soybeans. Otherwise, crop conditions mostly declined across the board. Corn is now rated 73% good to excellent, down 1 percentage point from the week prior. 76% of the crop has reached the silking stage, 26% at the dough stage, both near average though for this time of year. Soybeans improved slightly with 70% rated good to excellent, up 2 percentage points. About 76% of the crop is blooming and 41% are setting pods. On the winter wheat side, winter wheat harvest is now nearly 80% complete, just below the 5-year average of 81%, and spring wheat conditions have dropped to 49% good to excellent, down 3 percentage points from the week prior. 92% of the wheat has headed, and 1% of that crop is now harvested, Tanner. So we'll see how winter wheat harvest conditions come in as some of those final yield numbers get reported out here as that harvest continues to wrap up.
That's right. Well, we got some Argentinian news. The Argentina president, Javier Milei, announced a reduction in agriculture export duties just weeks after his government raised them. He made the announcement on Saturday, July 27th, during his speech at the annual Rural Expo in Buenos Aires. President Milei said the move is meant to support Argentina's farming sector, which he called the country's most productive. He said the reductions are permanent and will remain in place as long as he is in office. The cuts affect a range of key exports. Duties on beef dropped from 6.75% to 5%. Corn and sorghum were lowered from 12 to 9.5%. Sunflowers from 7 to 4%. Soybeans from 33% to 26%. And soybean byproducts from 31 to 24.5%. It always makes me wonder about those half percentages, Delaney. But nonetheless, the rollback follows backlash from farming groups after the government reinstated higher export taxes last month. Though President Milei said the cuts were made possible by a fiscal surplus. The announcement came after a strong message from the leader of Argentina's Rural Society. He called for export taxes to be completely eliminated. He said that farmers have contributed over $200 billion in the recent years and asked where that money has all gone. So more to probably come, but that's the update for now.
Well, in other international headlines this week, the U.S. and the European Union have reached a momentous new trade agreement. President Trump and the EU Commissioner, President Ursula von der Leyen, announced a deal on Sunday, July 27th in Scotland. It sets a 15% U.S. tariff on most European exports. That rate is half the rate that the U.S. had considered earlier this month. In return, the EU will invest about $600 billion into the U.S. market and increase specifically purchases of American energy and military equipment. The deal also removes tariffs on aircraft parts, some chemicals, generic drugs, and agricultural products. Steel and aluminum tariffs will still face 50%, and discussions will continue on alcohol and other goods. President Trump said the agreement strengthens U.S. exports and brings fairness to transatlantic trade. EU officials also welcomed the deal, but say the 15% tariffs is higher than they had hoped for. This deal comes, of course, just weeks after negotiations stalled, and the U.S. warned it would raise tariffs again starting August 1st. So this deal here comes just in the nick of time, as EU leaders had prepared to respond with duties on over $100 billion worth of American goods.
Yeah, we've got a lot of headlines this week on tariff news. Certainly got quite a bit this week. President Trump announced on Wednesday that the U.S. is going to reduce their tariffs on South Korean imports to that 15% rate. The rate had previously been set to go up to 25%. This change isn't a part of a new trade agreement that includes $350 billion in South Korean investment into U.S. projects and $100 billion in American energy purchases. The announcement followed a meeting when Trump and Korean officials had at the White House. South Korea will allow more U.S. products into its market, including auto and agricultural goods, without new import duties. Korean officials said that their rice and beef markets will remain closed, and the discussion on food regulations is still ongoing. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said that 90% of the profits from the investment fund will benefit Americans. About $150 billion will go towards shipbuilding. The remaining funds will support sectors like semiconductors, nuclear power, batteries, and biotech. The energy purchases will take place over the next 3.5 years and will include natural gas, oil, and a small amount of coal. Tariffs on South Korean autos will be lowered to that 15% figure. The exports of semiconductors and pharmaceuticals will not face any additional restrictions. Steel, aluminum, and copper are not covered in this agreement, however. South Korean companies have welcomed this agreement. Samsung signed a $16.5 billion chip deal with Tesla, while LG Energy Solutions secured a $4.3 billion contract to supply Tesla with their batteries. So lots of things moving there out of South Korea.
Well, we've got some other things moving out of the U.S. market, and that is U.S. beef. For the first time in 20 years, U.S. beef will be allowed to move into Australia, ending a long-standing ban due to mad cow disease concerns. Australia was one of the last countries to block U.S. beef after the discovery of mad cow disease back in the 1990s, after most other markets reopened years ago. President Trump helped secure the deal, which the National Cattlemen's Beef Association calls a big win for American farmers and ranchers. For nearly 2 decades, U.S. beef has been banned from Australia, while the U.S. imported $1.7 billion in Australian beef in 2024 alone. This agreement opens a new market for U.S. beef, especially in restaurants and for premium products. But livestock market analyst Shaylee Stewart says Australian beef prices are lower, and the U.S. cattle herd is so much smaller because of this deal. Prices probably won't change that much for U.S. producers, but Australia's cattle industry wants an independent scientific review before cattle imports begin, citing concerns about biosecurity. Secretary of Agriculture Rollins stood behind American farmers and ranchers, saying they produce the safest, healthiest beef in the world, saying, quote, "It's absurd that non-scientific trade barriers prevented our beef from being sold to consumers in Australia for the last 20 years. Gone are the days of putting American farmers on the sidelines." So a little bit of a mixed bag there, but seems like positive headlines, trade headlines here nonetheless. Tanner, for opening that market once again.
That's right. We've got an update on another headline that we reported on last week. The Union Pacific Railroad has announced plans to acquire the Norfolk Southern Railroad, creating the first U.S. transcontinental rail system. The combined network would connect 43 states and nearly 100 ports and cover nearly 50,000 route miles. The two companies plan to file their application with the Surface Transportation Board within the next 6 months. The approval process will review how the merger will improve safety, speed, reliability, and competition. The deal is expected to close in the early parts of 2027. Union Pacific will buy Norfolk Southern for $320 per share, which is 25% above recent prices. That deal puts a value together at $85 billion. Union Pacific CEO Jim Vania says in a quote, "This merger is the next step in advancing railroads, connecting key products and markets across our country." Norfolk Southern CEO Mark George also chimed in by saying they're confident this combination will strengthen America's first transcontinental railroad and benefit the economy. The National Grain and Feed Association spoke up, said it will undertake an extensive evaluation of the proposed merger to better understand the implications for the industry. Mike Steenhoek of the Soy Transportation Coalition says the deal will create winners and losers in the shipping industry.
Well, Tanner, as we take a look here at the latest USDA cattle inventory report that was released last Friday, July's report showed there were 94 million cattle and calves on U.S. farms as of July 1st. That number marks the lowest for mid-year inventory since 1973, reflecting some of those continued ongoing challenges we mentioned earlier. Additionally, the number of cattle placed in feedlots dropped to the lowest level since 2017. The report is based on more than 17,000 cattle producers surveyed nationwide, which provides, of course, a snapshot of current U.S. cattle herd inventories. The report's finding also included that there are 38 million cows and heifers calved. Beef cows total 28.7 million head. Dairy cow numbers equaled 9.45 million head. The calf crop is estimated at 33 million head, and cattle on feed stand at 13 million head. Dr. Darrell Peel, an agricultural economist at Oklahoma State University, says the latest USDA data does show, however, herd recovery is occurring, but at a slow and cautious pace. No rapid rebuilding is underway yet.
I did see that as well. I also saw, Delaney, that 2 more USDA nominees have now been cleared by the Senate Agricultural Committee. Now they just wait a full Senate vote. Richard Fordyce, who was nominated by President Trump to be the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation, was approved with a bipartisan support. Michael Boren, who was nominated for the Undersecretary role for Natural Resources and Environment, advanced on a party line vote. That will bring the total number of USDA nominees waiting for confirmation to 7. On Monday evening, Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he filed cloture on Tyler Clarkson's nomination for the USDA General Counsel. A Senate vote is expected later on. Other nominees still waiting for confirmation include Luke Lindbergh for the Undersecretary of Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Dudley Hoskins, the Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs, and Scott Hutchins for Undersecretary of Research and Education Economics. So a couple of waiting in the wings and others waiting for an official vote, but a couple of updates there, Delaney.
And Richard Fordyce should be a common, maybe common name for some of our listeners. He's a Missouri native, so not too far here from the state of Iowa, and kind of a name that's a mover and a shaker in the agriculture industry. So good to see a familiar face in the next administration here. But U.S. farm production expenses are expected to total nearly $478 billion for 2024, according to the latest USDA's Farm Production Expenditure Report released this week. That is a slight decline from the $482 billion spent in 2023, marking a less than 1% decrease in overall farm costs. The report shows that almost half of all total farm expenses come from four main areas: feed, farm services, labor, and livestock-related costs. Together, these top expenses totaled $230 billion in 2024. Feed alone accounted for 15% of spending, farm services and labor nearly 11%, and livestock and poultry expenses just over 10%. On average, farm expenses per operation fell just slightly to over $254,000, down from $255,000 in 2023. And breaking that down by sector, crop farm expenditures remain nearly steady at $252 billion, a small drop of just 0.1%. Livestock farm expenses declined more noticeably, however, falling 2% to $225 billion. Labor was the largest expense for crop farmers at $38 billion, and other significant costs included farm services, fertilizer, lime, soil conditioners, and rent. So, not a huge swing on the balance sheet here for 2024, and likely not ahead here again for 2025, Tanner.
Yes, exactly. Our last headline today, not super positive to end on a note, but certainly one worth noting. Firefighters in eastern Nebraska spent hours battling a fire on Tuesday after an explosion happened at the wood pellet manufacturing plant in Fremont. Unfortunately, authorities have confirmed that 3 people were killed. The blast had happened just before noon at Horizon Biofuels, a facility that makes animal bedding and wood pellets for heating and cooking. Fremont Mayor Joe Spelterberg said the victims included 2 young girls and a relative of an employee. The children were at the plant ahead of a doctor's appointment, waiting for their family member to finish work. Crews used heavy equipment to clear the rubble and safely enter part of the building to recover the victims, but that process took more than 24 hours due to unstable conditions and continued fire concerns. The investigation into what caused this blast, Delaney, is still ongoing.
Well, those folks are certainly in our thoughts, and a good reminder to safety always comes first in those situations. But Tanner, segueing into our interview for today, we of course had the opportunity to sit down earlier this week with Elizabeth Burns-Thompson, the new executive director of the Modern Ag Alliance. We talked about where the Alliance stands on some current legislative issues, the latest around chemical labeling in particular, and what's coming up next for groups in the weeks and months ahead. So let's turn it over to that conversation with EBT now. Well, you've probably seen the billboards or maybe some of the advertisements for this group, Modern Ag Alliance. We're welcomed today by the executive director of Modern Ag Alliance, Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today on the podcast. Thanks for coming on and joining us today.
It's always good to be back and appreciate the opportunity to chat about some of these issues. It's really time sensitive. So, yes.
And I have to admit, before you joined Modern Ag, they were not on my radar. I think you really helped to put them on the map. So for those of our listeners who were not aware of what Modern Ag Alliance did prior to you joining their staff, give us the 10,000-foot overview of what Modern Ag does today.
Absolutely. And no apologies needed, because one of the unique things about our organization is we are fairly new. So the organization itself is just a little over a year old. I had the great privilege to be able to join the team and begin to lead the initiative in January of this year. So I am closing in on 7 months, and they have been a very busy 7 months. And very proud to also have said we've grown the coalition throughout that time too. So as we stand here today, Modern Ag Alliance is composed of well over 100 different grower groups, really from coast to coast, including our friends across the ocean there in Hawaii, because we know there is a lot of agriculture that happens there as well. But we're talking your state farm bureaus, your state commodity associations, agribusiness associations, across nearly every state in the country, as well as many of their national counterparts. And we're talking about a cross section of commodities from the corn and soybeans that we all on this podcast here are familiar with, and kind of the heart of central part of the U.S., to potatoes, to sugar beets, to blueberries, to strawberries, to just a really broad cross section of agriculture. And I make that long kind of background to showcase that while it's a broad ranging membership of organizations, our focus is really narrow in ensuring that all farmers continue to have access to those critical crop protection tools, both now and into the future. And so we work tirelessly at state legislative bodies. We've been out in DC quite a bit very recently to ensure that farmers still have access to those pesticides and those chemistries that we know are a critical part of modern day production agriculture.
So, what's your biggest challenge when you do have those conversations with state legislatures and even on the federal level?
So there's no shortage of them, certainly. So I think I have found it the timing of being part of kind of critical issues. Pesticides are on the forefront of a lot of conversations right now, and not just the ones that we are proactively starting with some of the legislative solutions that we've teed up. So we were in 12 different states this year with proactive legislative solutions to help shore up some of that certainty. But on the flip side of that, we have watched from the political spectrum a growing movement, for lack of a better word, around the Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA. And while at its core, I think most of production ag would agree with the foundational goal of we all could do a little bit better to our health and wellness overall. What we don't want to see is that unwarranted doubts or uncertainties be placed on American farmers that have today and for generations been providing the most abundant and safest and most affordable food and fiber and fuel across this country. And a lot of that is reliant around having technologies and especially chemistries to be able to ensure that the productivity that's reflective in our fields is then thus translated to grocery stores or the fuel tank or you be it.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, Modern Ag has done this great job of starting to put billboards and advertisements out there to continue to advocate for why farmers should have access to some of these chemistries and tools, as you mentioned earlier. How have you gone about deciding how to place some of those messages and campaigns as you have in some of those key areas? I think about 235, when you head down to downtown Des Moines, heading toward our state capitol, there is a big, huge billboard that I see every time I drive down that way, advertising. I don't remember the exact campaign, but it's sponsored by Modern Ag Alliance. And I think what a great placement that is as you're heading toward the state capitol for folks to see that. Walk us through some of the decisions behind how you've gone about doing that and targeting those areas.
Well, I think it's twofold. So we've been very present in places where we had proactive legislation that we teed up at the early part of the year. So as many of your listeners know that we work state legislation predominantly in the early part of the year, so that January, February into about May. But it's one thing to do issue advocacy, but if I'm walking into a capitol or working with a legislator and saying, this is a problem and this is how we believe we can solve it, we've kind of missed the forest for the trees, because we've missed the whole opportunity or necessity really of laying some groundwork and education around the issue broadly. And so at Modern Ag, we really have taken it upon ourselves to go out and not just work with lawmakers and talk through the kind of the details of the solutions and the policy solutions, but we also understand that Joe Public necessarily needs more understanding about what we do in modern agriculture, why we do it, how we do it. And there is an incredible disconnect between the farm gate and frankly, Joe Public consumer. And so we are trying to insert ourselves into conversations that we know are already taking place. Like I mentioned, that the MAHA movement and the MAHA conversations, there are folks actively out there talking about the food supply, the food systems, and coming at it through a lens of thinking that there are necessarily changes that need to be made. What is incumbent upon agriculture is making sure that we're stepping forward and saying and explaining how we do things, why we do things, and pesticides are really the tip of the spear of what is a necessary part of that conversation. Because what and not to further belabor this, but I think the key point that growers that are listening to this here today need to take home is that the folks that are engaging in those conversations are ultimately the ones that are decision makers that will determine whether or not you continue to have the tools in your toolbox to be successful, right? So whether the chemistries that, throughout the summer, many of us are depending upon and are spraying in our fields right now, whether we not only continue to have those, but also whether or not we have an environment moving forward that new technologies and new active ingredients are brought forward.
So where is Modern Ag Alliance and farmers, for that sake, having the most success? Is it, certain states or certain policy that you've been seeing some good positive movements on?
Sure. So at our core, what we have been focused on at the state level really is to provide some clarity around what has become kind of a cluster around the pesticide labels. And the word label sounds somewhat benign, right? We think about something that's on the side of a box or on the side of any product today. But when we're discussing labels as it relates to pesticides, those are more along the lines of like, a permit to operate. There's something issued by the United States EPA. Many of the growers listening know that it's not as simple as one piece of paper. Many of these labels are 20, 30 pages long and an incredible amount of detail because of the science and justification that goes into that particular label. There has been an unfortunate situation with the legal system and some push and pull with products that's created really a regulatory nightmare for many manufacturers and agriculture writ large. And so what we have gone into about a dozen states so far is to pitch a solution that recognizes that once a company or a manufacturer is issued that federally approved label by EPA, that they have satisfied their state level responsibility for labeling or disclosure requirements. It sounds very intuitive, and at its core, that's why those bills are 1 page in length, because it is so simple. But that type of simplicity and clarity is really what is necessary for agriculture to ensure continued access to those products and continued manufacturing of those products here in this country. And so we've pitched that in a handful of places. We did get that legislation across the finish line and signed into law up in North Dakota, as well as down in Georgia. And we're continuing to work on it with lawmakers kind of broadly. There are a federal process for that is actually being discussed in DC right now. I've been out in DC about twice over the last handful of weeks discussing this particular provision, the Ag Labeling Uniformity Act. And we do foresee that it could have some traction moving forward, especially around a potentially a skinny farm bill for the terms that I think we've heard out of Chairman Thompson on the House side, as well as a potentially appropriations process. So I think agriculture has recognized just how important this issue is. And so whatever train is not only leaving the station, but moving through, we certainly want to make sure that this provision can be part of.
Because that's been the concern around some of the things even related to glyphosate, right? As I understand it, is that the EPA sets forth or approves a label, but then states are going around that and saying, well, in reality, our state wants this label approval and our state wants this label approval. And that's creating a lot of concern and chaos, really, for individual states and individual chemistry companies at a state level. Is that a good way to kind of summarize some of what's going on with glyphosate in particular?
Bingo. That's exactly right. And we saw it first come out of the state of California with Prop 65, where they attempted to try to add these additional disclaimers or things onto labels. And that push and pull dynamic has continued ever since for the last 10 years and has created really a multi-billion-dollar nightmare in the legal system all around what is or is not allowed on a label. And so that is what we are going in and shoring up and clarifying of who has what authority over what's on the label. And to sum it up in as simple of terms is the dynamic that we sit in right now is you have on one hand the trial lawyers that have said we are going to continue to sue agriculture until additional disclaimers or warnings or whatever you want to call it are added to these labels. And on the other side, you have the regulator with the EPA that says, we don't just put things on labels. They have to have scientific justification. And so you cannot just add a disclaimer on a label. It will be misbranding, and that product would not be eligible to be marketed or put forward on the market. And so agriculture sits truly between rock and hard place, name your type of scenario, but there is not a pathway forward without this clarity. And so that's what we're working so diligently on.
So what's next? As you work forward, what's ahead?
That's a great question, Tanner. And I do think you had mentioned, Delaney, that this glyphosate or what folks know of as Roundup is kind of the tip of the spear, the focal point right now. The importance of that being because it's laying the groundwork for what anti-agriculture or the trial community likely is going to stand to target moving forward, or this becomes a bellwether for what every other chemistry or chemical moving forward stands to gain or endure, I should say. And so if we lose glyphosate because we've allowed this process to continue to unfold, we have only likely expediting the loss of every other chemistry and chemical that we depend upon in modern ag at an exponential rate, and also completely put a halt on anything new coming to the market, because it's just a dynamic that is not something that the industry can compete or even operate within. So we still have a lot of groundwork to make up, Tanner, to your point, and hopefully we can get those solutions put forward. But it's an incredible coalition that we have at Modern Ag, and I'm really excited to see what we could potentially grow into the future. But there's certainly no shortage of problems or challenges for agriculture to overcome. So we'll continue working towards them.
And for any growers that are listening and thinking, oh no, we've got, these massive challenges and hurdles ahead of us, what can they do to get involved to ensure that these tools and technologies don't get taken away?
I've said for a long time, if you don't know who your local elected officials are, that's a great place to start. If you don't have them on speed dial, that should be the next step, number 2, so that you know them and they know you, and that there's a relationship there, so that when we can get into having conversations about some of these tougher issues like pesticide governance and labels and the nitty-gritty details of those, that they know and you're a trusted resource. So take the time to get to know people, especially elected officials at the state level, local level, national level. And if you need help in terms of the nuances or details of this particular issue, I would encourage folks to reach out to our website, modernagalliance.org. We have a wealth of resources and a lot of things that are very state specific as well. Background on legislation that we've worked on, as well as some data points and things like that, and collaborating with our partner groups, because I venture to guess that whatever state you have listening in on us today, we probably have a partner organization or a handful that we are working with diligently in that state.
Well, it's always great to catch up with you. I appreciate you giving us an update to share with our listeners. I know we'll have you back on as things continue to progress, but again, thanks for joining us today.
Always great to be here. Thank you so much, guys.
It was certainly on the top of mind of farmers everywhere. So as we got to experience the one day only field day, which I thought was a fascinating concept, it was proven, in fact, that there was no shortage of content to take in. We got to hear Tommy Gashafi talk about markets. Always animated, probably due back on the podcast again to share some perspective with our listeners. But more than ever, I felt like there was some positive farmer sentiment, at least in maybe the nature of being all banded together, and some hope for the future. But only time will tell when those combines roll through the field as to what the story really ends as.
Well, that certainly is a good perspective there, Tanner, and a good reminder to get a little fresh market intel here on the podcast soon. Folks, you can follow along with us on social media as well, where we share market intel and other updates. Find us on all major social media platforms at Ag News Daily. But Tanner, what do you say we wrap up this week's show and let everybody go?
Let's let them go.